The year is 1976, and 15-year-old Dawn Schiller is traveling cross country with her father Wayne and her younger sister Terry, who's about 14. They're traveling from Florida to California, where Dawn's father wants to start a new life after just divorcing Dawn's mother, Etta. And when they arrive in California, Dawn meets John Holmes, the most famous porn star in the world. I mean, like on the very first day. How in the world does that happen? Well, I'm about to give you a little bit of background on Dawn's story. This is my review for Dawn's memoir, The Road Through Wonderland, Surviving John Holmes. So, Dawn was born in 1961. Her father was Dwayne Schiller. Her mother was Etta Schiller. And I really think it's important to understand Dawn's background and her early childhood and teenage years so that you understand how she ended up with a person like John Holmes. So Dawn's father was in the army and he was stationed in Germany, and that's where he met Dawn's mother, Etta. Etta had been orphaned just after World War II. She was sent to a Catholic orphanage, and she met Dawn's father, Dwayne, while he was stationed in Germany. And I think this is really important because Dawn's mother, Etta, she came from a troubled background, obviously, because she was orphaned. She lost her family in World War II, or at least her parents, I believe. She was somehow orphaned. And so she had her own trauma to deal with. And she thought that she was really lucky when she met Dawn's father, who was this handsome GI, and he swept her off her feet, and he was going to take her to America where the streets were paved with gold and everything. Her life was just going to be wonderful. But unfortunately, it didn't really turn out that way. So we're going to get into that. So Dawn had two other siblings. She had a younger sister, Terry, and a younger brother who was born a few years later. I think his name was also Dwayne Jr. So, like I mentioned, Dawn's father was in the military, and he was sent to Vietnam twice. In fact, I think he signed up to go to Vietnam, so that says a lot about his personality. Dawn didn't say this in her memoir, but I gather from reading her book that her father was just this kind of restless person, and he was not always there. He was an absentee father, I guess you could say. Yes, it was his job. He was in the army. He had to go wherever the army sent him, but he seemed to be away from home a lot, and sometimes I think that was by choice. And I believe he was also a machine gunner, and the average lifespan of machine gunners was just a few days, so somehow he managed to survive, and that's pretty remarkable. But he was gone a lot, and as I mentioned, Etta was from Germany. She didn't have a really good grasp of the English language. She was very embarrassed about her accent, and so I think that was it's not really a big deal, but probably she felt that it held her back. Maybe also, just a lack of education and skills. She had to work at waitressing jobs, and when the family would move to Florida and Dwayne was gone, she worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. But I'm going to get into that in just a minute. So during Dawn's early years, she lived temporarily with her grandmother and her aunt, I think her father's grandmother, her great-grandmother, on her father's side of the family. They had a home in New Jersey, and those years were pretty good for Dawn and stable. But then when her father comes back from one of his tours, he decides that he wants to go live in Florida. So that's what they do. And that's where things kind of take a turn for the worse. Dwayne is gone a lot. The children are latchkey kids, meaning that they are young and they are left alone. They end up living in, I think it's Carroll City, which is, I think it's part of Miami or just outside of Miami, Florida, which was already turned into a very dangerous neighborhood. Kids were subjected to a lot of bullying and fighting, and they would skip school a lot. Their mother was gone, so they were kind of left to their own devices. They got into smoking pot at an early age, and Dawn just looked back at those years and just said that they weren't good years for her. They were not good at all. So finally, Dwayne comes home from Vietnam, and he stays there about a year, maybe a little bit less than that. He's just this restless kind of person. And tells his wife one day, hey, I'm going to go to Iran and I'm going to work for, I think it's AT&T. Anyway, he's going to go overseas again. But during the whole time that he's gone, he never sends any money home. And in fact, one time he contacts Etta and asks her to send him money because somehow he ended up in a jail in Thailand and needed money to get out. So he wasn't always in Iran at that time. And as it turned out, he actually met another woman who he fell in love with. This is important because when he comes back home for the final time, after being gone, well, not the final time, but after being gone while his kids are growing up, he missed all of those growing up years. The mother is always working. She's working 3 jobs, and the kids are left by themselves. So when he comes home, he asks his wife for a divorce, and of course, the family just kind of disintegrates after that, or at least not really, but it falls apart. He tells the girls that he's going to move to California, his children, and he gives each of them, even the son also, the opportunity to go with him. They have a choice between staying with their mother or going with Dwayne. And the girls decide that they want to go with Dwayne. And the boy, the son, he's going to stay with his mother, of course, because he's younger than the girls, and he feels like he would be better off with his mother, which was probably for the best. Also, something that's very important is that Dawn's father gets cancer from handling Agent Orange while he's in Vietnam. Of course, he doesn't know this until after he comes back home. Maybe a few years later, he has this tumor on his nose, and of course he goes to the doctor to have it checked out, and they tell him that the only thing that they can do is to cut off his entire nose, which happens. And so that's something that's very important because Dawn really felt sorry for her father. At that time in her life, she really idolized her father. I mean, she had been away from him for so long, and her mother, it's really sad. Her mother was, like I mentioned, she had her own issues and trauma, and she was still in love with Dwayne, I think, and she was heartbroken. Dawn recounted in her book that she would hear her mother crying sometimes, crying herself to sleep at night when she thought the children were already asleep in bed. She could hear her mother crying. So it was very traumatic. And the mother could be abusive to the kids when they, she would sometimes smack them to keep them in line, I guess you could say. So Dawn, that's putting it mildly. Dawn wanted to get away from her mother, and she thought her dad was cool. She thought that he was this hero who had served in Vietnam, because that's what she was told when she was a little girl, that he was fighting for his country, and she was proud of that. And her dad, when he came back from Vietnam, he was like this hippie type of character. Of course, he was not that young. He's in his 30s, but anyway, I mean, he was not a teenager. But he had grown his hair out kind of long, and he smoked pot, and Dawn thought she just had the coolest dad. So Dawn felt like she needed a change. She wanted to get away from Carol City, and her mother could be, she could lash out at the kids. There were some incidents where, she could be physical with the kids. And, Dawn just thought she might be happier with her dad. And she convinced Terry, her younger sister, to go with her and her dad to California, which Terry did. Terry brought her boyfriend along as well. I think his name was Juan. But he's not really that important to the story, so I'm not going to get into that. They travel cross country from Florida to California, sleeping outdoors or in the car along the way. They don't, spend the night in a motel anywhere. They just eat cheap food because, Dawn's father, believe it or not, he just doesn't have a lot of money. You would think that, being in the military for several years, that he would have some savings, but apparently not. Dawn's mother was the main breadwinner, as it turns out. And as I think I already mentioned, she worked 3 waitressing jobs. So she had it rough, and she had every right to be angry at Dawn's father. So Dawn said she felt a lot of compassion for her father because he had his nose removed because of the cancer, and he would have to change his bandages frequently. Even when they were traveling cross country, he was in pain a lot, and I can't imagine not having a nose. Of course, he would keep his face bandaged, but she said that when he did have his bandages, you could see right into his sinuses. So she felt sorry for him, and she understood why he wanted to smoke pot, because it eased his pain. And one day they're wanting to get some marijuana because they're out, they don't have any more. And what do you know? They see this hitchhiker that's like straight out of a cliche. He's got long hair, he's got striped bell bottoms, and a fringed bag that he's carrying over his shoulder. He's hitchhiking, and they decide to pick him up because they think he looks like he might have some marijuana, which he does. So they give him a ride, and he travels with them, sharing pot, sharing stories. And when he finds out that they're homeless and they don't have any definite plans about where they're going to stay, they're just kind of winging it, he suggests that they can stay with this lady that he knows that she's a friend. She rents an apartment, and that she might let them stay with her, which, he convinces her to let them stay whenever they finally arrive in California. And what do you know? John Holmes and his wife, they manage those apartments where this woman lives. And John is like a handyman. He's also he is the most famous porn star in the world at the time, besides Linda Lovelace, but the male porn star. But they don't know, they have no clue about who he is. Whenever they meet him that first day, when they arrive, they don't know who he is. And both the girls, Dawn and Terry, think that he's just like the biggest geek, that he wears the most outrageous clothing. He's this tall, skinny guy, with this curly, as it was described, kind of an afro hair. I mean, that was actually his natural hair. I mean, it was curly like that. And of course, it was the 70s. So, but it becomes apparent to Dawn's sister very early on that he has a crush on Dawn. And remember that Dawn is 15 years old. So that's how they meet. That's how they end up together. And what is the likelihood that this would happen? I mean, it almost seems like fate, but fortunately, it's a very sad story. But I just thought that was really important to understand how Dawn ended up meeting John Holmes. John Holmes, they didn't know it at the time. They didn't know who he was, first of all. Dawn would find out, but as she mentioned, she did not know anything about pornography, even though it was the 70s and pornography was around. Her and her sister, and I guess her brother too, they had never been exposed to pornography. Of course, this was the days before the internet, and even before VCRs and DVD players. So the only thing that they had seen is maybe occasionally Playboy, as she mentioned once in an interview. That was about it. That's the closest thing to porn that they ever saw. So they didn't know who he was, but she would soon learn who he was. But John Holmes, I mean, of course, nobody really knew at the time, but he was a predator, and he immediately sensed, well, he was attracted to Dawn because she's very young. Like I mentioned, he was the biggest porn star in the world, and Los Angeles was filled with beautiful women everywhere, adult women. He could have probably had his pick. But yet he chose to prey on a young girl. He was attracted to young, and Dawn was very petite girls. He sensed immediately that she was poor. Her family was homeless at the time. And he just started grooming her. And Dawn's book is not about, of course, John Holmes is a main character in her book, obviously, because that's what she's writing about, her relationship with him. But she doesn't really go into his whole life story, his background, his childhood, his teenage years. She just picks up from the time that she meets him, and then it talks about her relationship with him. He immediately started grooming her and, working his charm. And that's the thing. Some people that can't understand what attracted her to him, but he was just very charming. Um, you have to read the book to understand how he was able to charm her and eventually seduce her. And John was married when he met Dawn and her family, and he stayed married for for several years. He was married to a woman named Sharon, who was very straight. And that's a whole other story, which I'm not really going to get into. I don't know why Sharon didn't divorce John immediately. I think eventually she did, but she stayed married to him for a long time, even when he was having a relationship with Dawn. And in fact, Dawn, for a time, she lived with them. You got to read the book if you want to learn more. Sharon was a very intelligent woman. She reportedly had an IQ of 160. So I heard. She was also a nurse. So at the time, her and John, they were making pretty good money, but John got hooked on freebase cocaine eventually. Not when Dawn met him immediately, but afterwards, a few years later, he got hooked on freebase cocaine. And of course, everything took a turn for the worse. And Dawn's book is about meeting her early childhood, how she ended up where she did, how she met John Holmes, and how she survived him, as she says, as the title says. John would eventually get Dawn hooked on drugs as well. And I guess the polite word to say is to sell her. He sold her to Eddie Nash, which was a famous, I don't know what you would call him, nightclub owner in Los Angeles, but he was also very dangerous. He was also a drug user and probably involved in just about every kind of, criminal activity that you can think of. And so John introduced her to that world, and it was not an easy thing to get away from him. And if you want to learn more, I highly recommend checking out Dawn Schiller's book, The Road Through Wonderland, Surviving John Holmes. I really enjoyed it, and I found it deeply inspirational. I don't want to tell you guys anymore. I've already told you enough. So I recommend checking it out sometime. I wish she had it in an audio version, but unfortunately she does not.